The mountain man killed his fat wife and baby. But this obese girl discovered the truth. The mountain man killed his fat wife and baby. That was the sentence every child in Redemption Falls learned before they learned to cross the street. Men repeated it over whiskey. Women hissed it over laundry lines. Preachers used it as a warning about sin and punishment. They said his name was Jacob Winters, 35, broad as a barn door, living alone high above the tree line, where the wind screamed like souls in torment. 5 winters earlier, townsfolk had ridden up to his cabin and found blood spattered across the snow. A dead grizzly sprawled in the yard, and 2 fresh graves behind the house. Jacob had stood there with a bloody axe hanging from his hand, his gray eyes hollow, his clothes torn and soaked. No one saw a body. No one waited for an explanation. Fear rushed in where facts were missing. By the time the posse rode back down the mountain, the story had already become a legend. The mountain man had snapped. He'd butchered his big, homely wife and their newborn. He'd lost his mind. He'd become a demon. Parents used his name to keep their children in line. Finish your chores, or Jacob Winters will come down from the mountain. Sheriff Mallory, who had been there that bloody day, never corrected them. If anything, he embellished it. It suited him to have a monster on the ridge, something worse than himself. On a bitter night in the winter of 1881, the rumor floated through the Golden Lantern Saloon again. A group of ranch hands were laughing at the idea of any woman being desperate enough to marry a man like Jacob. Hell, only a fat sow would climb that mountain for him, one man snorted, and he'd probably chop her up too. In the corner, a girl in a too-tight brown dress flinched. Eliza Hart, 24, large-boned and soft-fleshed, with cheeks that flushed at the slightest attention, pretended to polish the same glass over and over. She'd been called Sow so often she sometimes forgot her real name. What none of them knew was that before the next sunrise, Eliza Hart would be crawling through the snow, bleeding and half frozen, leaving a red trail up the mountain toward the cabin of the man everyone called a murderer. And what she found there would tear the town's favorite story to pieces. As you listen to this, imagine the snow under your hands, the wind in your face, and tell me in your heart, where in the world would you be hearing this from if you were by that fire tonight watching her climb? Eliza Hart had been born big and stayed that way. In a town where food was scarce and hard work carved people into lean lines, her softness was treated like a sin. Her father, Amos Hart, liked to joke that she had eaten her mother in the womb. No one laughed harder than he did. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and Amos never forgave the baby for surviving. By 14, Eliza towered over the other girls, her skirts pulling tight across hips that made dressmakers sigh and cluck. Boys dared each other to pinch her arm and run. Men stared at her with the same expression they gave a heavy draft horse. Useful, maybe, but never beautiful. She learned early to make herself small in all the ways that didn't involve her body. She kept her voice quiet, her gaze down, her hands busy. She cleaned the house until her knuckles cracked. She took in mending. She baked bread for neighbors who never once invited her to share a slice. At 19, Amos tried to marry her off to a widower, twice her age, who wanted a strong back and a cheap cook. The man had looked her up and down with a calculating squint and said, "She'll do, long as she don't eat like 2 men." Eliza had stood in the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and said, "No." Amos backhanded her so hard she tasted blood. The wedding never happened, but the price of that one word followed her for years. Ungrateful, the town called her, too picky for what she is. By 24, she was sleeping in a narrow cot behind the golden lantern, working 16 hours a day for a wage so small it barely bought her soap. She waited tables, scrubbed floors, and endured the jokes that came whenever men had drunk enough to forget she had ears. "Careful, boys," the owner, Mr. Talbot, would crow. "If she falls, the whole damn town will shake." Eliza would smile politely and carry another tray. Later, alone in the tiny room that smelled of stale beer and lye, she would press her hands into her stomach as if she could push it inward, as if she could mold herself into something more acceptable. She heard the story of Jacob Winters 100 times from 100 mouths. Each retelling grew bloodier, uglier, more convenient. A fat wife, a cursed baby, a man too wild to live among decent folk. Once, when she was sweeping near the card tables, Sheriff Mallory leaned back in his chair and told the tale like a showman. "I saw it myself," he boasted. "Blood on the walls. That big woman of his must have weighed twice what this girl does." He jerked his thumb toward Eliza without looking at her. He finally snapped, couldn't stand the sight of her, axed her to pieces, baby too, buried them like scraps. The men laughed, drunk on horror and whiskey. Eliza's vision blurred. She kept sweeping until her fingers went numb around the broom handle. That night, lying awake, she felt something sharp twist inside her. Not just shame, anger. Anger that every story in this town turned women like her into monsters or burdens or jokes. Even the dead ones weren't spared. 3 months later, Amos Hart showed up at the saloon's back door smelling of cheap liquor and desperation. He demanded money. When Eliza could not give him enough, he called her a useless cow and told her to pack whatever she owned. "You're done," he slurred. "I'm not feeding you with the little pride I've got left. Go find some fool who'll haul you up a mountain and hide you where no one has to see you." He shoved her into the alley. The door slammed shut behind her. Eliza stood there, clutching a carpetbag that held everything she owned: 2 dresses, a worn Bible, and a small tin of coins she'd hidden for years. The sky above Redemption Falls was a hard, merciless black. She could have gone back, begged Mr. Talbot for a pallet in the storeroom and a few more hours of work. She could have found another town exactly like this one and started the same misery all over again. Instead, with a heart battered but not yet broken, Eliza Hart turned away from the lamps of Redemption Falls and began to walk into the dark. The cold met her first. Outside the town's last lantern, winter pressed in like a living thing. Snow had fallen all day, heavy and relentless, and now it lay in thick drifts along the road, swallowing sound. The mountains loomed ahead, their black ridgelines cutting jagged teeth into the sky. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept walking. Each breath burned her lungs. Her boots, already thin at the soles, soaked through within minutes. She didn't have a plan, only a direction, away from voices that called her names, away from eyes that measured and condemned. She walked until the town lights shrank to a smudge behind her. The road narrowed, the ruts of wagon wheels iced over and treacherous. Pine trees gathered on either side, their branches heavy with snow, leaning close as if to listen. By midnight, her toes were numb. Her fingers felt like pieces of wood. She told herself she would stop at the next bend, then the next, chasing some imaginary safe place she couldn't name. That was when she heard them, men's voices, slurred and mean, drifting through the dark, the clink of saddle leather, the crunch of hooves in snow. Eliza's heart lurched. There was nowhere to hide on the open road, but she stumbled toward the trees anyway, trying to make herself invisible among the shadows. Too late. Well, what do we have here? A lantern swung toward her, spilling harsh yellow light across her face. 3 men on horseback ringed her in, their breath steaming in the cold. One wore the red kerchief of a road gang Eliza had heard about in whispers. Thieves who hunted travelers too far from town to be protected by law. "Lost, sweetheart?" he drawled. His gaze slid over her body with lazy contempt. "You're a long way from the trough." They took her bag first, upending it in the snow. The dresses, the Bible, the coins she had saved penny by penny for years, all spilled out like a mockery of her careful plans. One man pocketed the tin. Another picked up her Bible and tossed it into a drift. "Please," Eliza said, her teeth chattering, "just let me go. I have nothing worth taking." The leader leaned down from his saddle and caught her chin in his gloved hand. His fingers dug into the soft flesh. "You're wrong about that," he said softly. "Men will pay for anything if they're drunk enough." Fear washed over her, colder than the snow, heavier than the night. She jerked back, wrenching free, and ran. She didn't get far. The blow caught her across the shoulders, sending her sprawling. Pain exploded down her arm as she crashed into the ice-hard road. A boot struck her ribs. Another slammed into her leg. Someone laughed. Then there was a different sound, sharp, violent, unexpected. A gunshot cracked the air, then another. A horse screamed. The lantern dropped into the snow, its light spinning wildly. "Ride!" someone shouted. "It's him!" The rest of the sentence was lost in the thunder of hooves as the men scrambled into the dark. In seconds, they were gone, their curses snatched away by the wind. Silence closed in. Only Eliza's ragged breathing remained. She tried to stand. Pain lanced up her left side. Her leg buckled. Warmth trickled down from her shoulder where something sharp had torn her skin. When she pressed her hand there, it came away sticky and dark. She was alone on the mountain road, beaten, robbed, bleeding into the snow. Above her, clouds shifted. For a moment, the moon broke through, silver and cold, revealing a faint glow far up the slope. A single square of light in the darkness. A cabin window. She stared at it, dazed. She had heard of no other place up here. The only soul foolish or stubborn enough to live this far from town was the one every mother warned her children about. Jacob Winters. The thought should have turned her back. Instead, it pushed her forward. Maybe she didn't believe in the stories as much as the others did. Maybe she believed them too much and decided that if she was going to die anyway, she might as well knock on the devil's door and make him look her in the eye. Eliza dragged herself off the road and began to climb toward that wavering light. Each movement sent shards of pain through her body. Her breath came in sobs. Snow soaked her dress, clung to her hair, weighed her down. Still, she clawed her way upward, leaving a thin, broken trail of red behind her. By the time she reached the cabin porch, she could no longer feel her hands. She lifted them anyway and knocked. Once, twice, a third time, weaker than a whisper. The door opened. A man filled the frame, blocking the lamplight behind him, and he was enormous, shoulders thick beneath a worn flannel shirt, hair black and uncombed, beard wild around a stern mouth. His eyes, a storm gray that seemed almost silver in the lamplight, swept over her, taking in the blood, the torn dress, the way she swayed on her knees. For a heartbeat, Eliza thought he might shut the door. The stories crowded in, suffocating, the axe, the graves, the wife everyone said he'd hated. Instead, he stepped out into the cold, bent down, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. "You shouldn't have come up here," Jacob Winters said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. Then the world went black. When Eliza woke, she thought she was dead. She lay under a pile of blankets so heavy it felt like earth itself pressing down on her. Heat licked at her cheeks from somewhere nearby, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something savory, meat and herbs simmering long and slow. Pain pulsed through her body, but it was distant, muffled, as if someone had wrapped it in wool and tucked it away. Slowly, she pried her eyes open. A low ceiling of rough-hewn beams hovered above her. The walls were made of logs chinked with moss and clay. Across the room, a stone fireplace glowed orange. Flames dancing around a black iron pot hung over the coals. Shelves, lined with jars of preserved fruit and vegetables, covered one wall. A heavy table, scarred by years of use, sat under a small window rimmed with frost. She was in a cabin. His cabin. Someone had removed her ruined dress and slipped a coarse but clean shirt over her head. Her left leg was splinted, wrapped in strips of linen. A bandage circled her shoulder, tight but not painful. She felt strangely light, as though part of her had been washed away. To her right, a chair creaked. Jacob Winters sat there, elbows on his knees, watching her with that same storm-gray gaze. In the daylight, he looked less like a demon and more like a man exhausted down to the bone. His dark hair was streaked with a few early threads of silver. His beard, though wild, had been trimmed with a rough attempt at order. The lines around his mouth spoke of years of clenching his jaw against words he didn't say. "You're awake?" he said. His voice was quiet, cautious, as if loud sounds might break something fragile in the room. Eliza tried to speak, but her throat was dry. He reached for a tin cup and held it to her lips. The water inside was cool and tasted faintly of metal and pine. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. "You were lucky," he said after a moment. "The knife missed anything that matters. The leg." He hesitated, glancing toward the splint. "It'll mend if you don't fight it." Memories slammed back into her. The road, the thieves, the blows, the faint light on the mountain, crawling, knocking, his voice in the dark. "Why?" she croaked. He frowned. "Why what?" "Why help me?" Eliza whispered. They say you kill people up here." For a flicker of a second, something raw crossed his face. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a familiar blankness she recognized, because she used it too. "They say a lot of things," Jacob replied. "The world's colder down there than it is up here. You were dying on my doorstep. I don't leave things to die if I can help it." He said it simply, as if he were talking about an injured deer, a broken fence post, a fire that needed tending. He didn't ask who she was or why she climbed his mountain. Not that day, not the next. The first week was a blur of fever and half-dreams. Eliza floated in and out of sleep, waking to the sound of logs thrown onto the fire, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of Jacob's voice when he thought she couldn't hear. Never words addressed to her, just small sounds that meant he was there, humming an old tune under his breath, muttering at the stubborn hinge of the door, cursing softly when he burned his hand. She watched him through slitted eyes. He moved with the wary grace of a man used to carrying heavy things through treacherous ground. In the mornings, he shrugged into a thick coat and disappeared into the blinding white outside, returning hours later with hairs slung over his shoulder or an armload of wood. He worked silently, efficiently, every task done with a care that bordered on tenderness. He never touched her unless he had to. When he changed her bandages, his hands were steady and impersonal. When he lifted her to adjust the blankets or help her sit, he avoided looking at more of her than necessary, as if determined not to shame her dignity. It was a strange kindness, and it unnerved her more than cruelty would have. By the end of the second week, the fever broke. The world snapped into sharper focus. The crackle of the fire, the smell of pine pitch, the biting draft that slipped under the door whenever the wind howled outside. Eliza insisted on helping. "Let me at least peel potatoes," she said one evening, when he brought in a sack of them dusted with dirt. "I'm tired of lying here like a sack myself." He hesitated, then handed her a knife. Her fingers fumbled at first, stiff from weeks of stillness, but muscle memory returned. She had peeled enough potatoes in the Golden Lantern's kitchen to last 3 lifetimes. The rhythm calmed her. Scrape, turn, slice, scrape, turn, slice. Jacob watched from the stove, pretending not to. From that small beginning, more tasks followed. She folded the blankets neatly each morning. She swept the floor from her chair. When she could bear weight on her injured leg, she limped to the table to wash dishes, her hip bumping the edge each time and sending a quiet jolt of embarrassment through her. "If you break a plate, I can always make another," Jacob said once, seeing her flinch. "The mountain's full of rock. Not many women." It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him. Over time, the cabin began to feel less like a stranger's refuge and more like, not quite home, but something that might grow into it. The fire was always lit before the sun dipped. The pot on the hook never sat empty. Jacob built her a proper bed frame, rough but sturdy, so she wouldn't have to lie on a pallet on the floor. "You didn't have to do that," she said, running her fingers along the smooth, sanded wood. He shrugged. "Sleeping on the ground is fine if you have to. You don't have to." Some nights, the wind screamed so hard around the cabin that the logs creaked. Eliza would lie awake, heart pounding, remembering hands grabbing at her on the road. In those moments, the rumors about Jacob whispered louder in her mind than the wind itself. Did he really kill them? Did he drag his axe through flesh where he now chopped firewood? Did their ghosts watch her from the corners while she slept in the bed he'd made? One sleepless night, she heard a different sound, a voice, broken and quiet, traveling on the thin air between the cabin and the world outside. She sat up, wincing, and followed it to the small window above the table. Frost webbed the glass, but through its milky veil she saw the outline of Jacob's broad back. He knelt in the snow by 2 small shapes half buried in drifts, 2 mounds side by side, graves. His head was bowed, his shoulders shook. "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered. "I'm sorry, little one. I tried. I swear to you, I tried." The words floated up through the night, thin and fragile as smoke. Eliza pressed her palm to the cold glass and listened. "I couldn't save you," he went on. "That's the truth of it. They think I killed you, but I failed you. Maybe there's no difference." Eliza closed her eyes. Something inside her shifted, like ice cracking on a river in spring. The town's favorite story had never mentioned Jacob Winters crying alone in the snow. In the weeks that followed, Eliza pretended she had never heard him at the graves. Jacob, for his part, pretended nothing inside him had cracked open on that frozen night. They continued their quiet dance around each other. He showed her how to stack wood so it dried faster, how to bank a fire so it smoldered all night, how to listen for the subtle change in the wind that meant a storm was coming. She showed him how to stretch flour with mashed potatoes to make it last, how to patch shirts so the mending didn't chafe, how to add a pinch of dried sage at just the right moment to turn a pot of rabbit stew into something that tasted like a small miracle. One morning, as she swept under the table, her broom struck something solid. She knelt and pulled out a tin box. Its lid rusted, the edges dented. "What's this?" she asked. Jacob glanced over from the stove. For a heartbeat, fear flashed in his eyes so naked it made her breath catch. "Just old things," he said. "Leave it." But curiosity was a stubborn thing, especially in someone who had lived most of her life without any secrets of her own. That night, while Jacob was outside checking traps, Eliza sat on the floor by the hearth with the tin box in her lap. Her conscience pricked, but she told herself that if she was going to live in a murderer's house, she had a right to know what buried things he kept. The lid resisted, then gave with a soft, tearing sound. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded floral cloth, lay a handful of objects. A silver locket, tarnished but lovingly polished, a small carved wooden toy in the shape of a bird, a folded bundle of papers stained at the edges. Eliza's fingers hovered over them, trembling. Finally, she picked up the papers and unfolded them. The first page was a letter, written in a looping hand that seemed to dance across the lines. "My dearest Jacob, if you're reading this, it means I'm ready to come home. The baby kicks like a mule, and my sister says that means she'll be strong. Don't let our little girl climb too high in the trees no matter what she tells you." The words blurred as Eliza's vision swam. Mary. It had to be Mary, the wife the town said he hated, the wife they said he had chopped to pieces. The second paper was different, not a letter, an official document, crinkled and stained. Eliza squinted at the formal script. Redemption Falls Territorial Office, July 3, 1876. Statement of witness. I, Elias Turner, being of sound mind, do swear that on June 28th I did see a grizzly bear attack Mary Winters. Her eyes darted down the page, catching fragments. Mary harvesting berries, a bear sow with cubs. The scream, Jacob running with an axe, blood everywhere, Mary's belly torn, the baby delivered too early in the snow, Mary's death, the child's brief, doomed breaths. At the bottom, a shaky signature, Elias Turner, and beside it, another, Mallory Kane, sheriff. He had known. The sheriff who told the town that Jacob was a mad butcher had witnessed enough to know the truth, or at least enough to know he wasn't sure. A floorboard creaked. Eliza's head snapped up. Jacob stood in the doorway, snow in his hair, his coat open, his eyes locked on the open tin in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "I told you to leave it," he said, his voice low. "I know," she replied, her own voice barely more than a breath. "But I couldn't. Not when every person down that mountain thinks they already know who you are." Something dark flickered across his face. Not rage. Something more dangerous. the tiredness of a man who has fled from his own story for so long he can barely bear to hear it spoken. "It's none of their business," he muttered. "It's none of yours." "It became my business the night I bled on your porch," Eliza shot back, surprising herself with the force in her own words. "It became my business when I heard you apologize to the dead for crimes you didn't commit." He froze. Slowly, she held up the statement, her finger resting under the sheriff's signature. "He knew," she said. "Mallory. He was there. He heard what this man saw. He knew it was the bear." Jacob's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. "He came up with the posse," he said after a moment. "They asked what happened. I told them I failed. I told them I didn't get there in time. The old man, Turner, he tried to explain, but his mind was going. They chose the story they liked better. A story where a fat woman is a burden to be rid of," Eliza said bitterly. "Where a man who loved her must have hated her. It fits what they believe about people like us." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The distance he had kept between them since the day he carried her inside shrank by half. "She wasn't a burden," he said hoarsely. "Mary was light. She made this place feel like more than wood and stone. She made me forget how quiet it gets up here when the snow comes." Eliza swallowed past the ache in her throat. "They stole that from you. From her," she said. "From both of you." "I let them," he replied. "I was too tired to fight their mouths. I thought maybe if the world decided I was a monster, I wouldn't have to walk around pretending I wasn't." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Inside, a different storm was building. A week later, a trader from town arrived with a sled of supplies and news. "They say Amos Hart's girl went missing," he told Jacob, stamping snow from his boots. "Big one, works at the Lantern. Sheriff says you probably snatched her." Eliza, hidden behind the bedroom curtain, felt the floor tilt beneath her. The trader went on, enjoying his own story. "Mal says he's tired of that cabin hanging over his town like a bad conscience. Talking about coming up here with a posse, rescuing the girl and dragging you down in chains. Says he should have done it 5 years ago." When the man left, the cabin felt smaller than it ever had. "So that's it," Jacob said quietly. "They've been gnawing on my bones in their minds for so long, they finally decided to take a bite for real." Eliza stared at the folded statement on the table. The ink faded, but still legible. Proof. Evidence. A story that had never been allowed to be heard. "Then we give them something else to chew on," she said. "The truth." The posse arrived at dawn. Eliza heard them before she saw them. The crack of branches, the muffled curses as horses slipped on ice, the sharp, officious bark of Sheriff Mallory's voice. Jacob had been up since before first light, stacking wood by the door, checking the rifle twice, his movements calm, almost painfully controlled. "Go into the bedroom," he told her when the first rider appeared between the pines. "Bolt the door. No matter what they say, you stay there." "No," Eliza said. Her legs still ached in the cold, but she stood straight. "I'm done hiding behind doors while men decide what my story is." The knock, when it came, rattled the frame. "Winters!" Mallory's voice boomed through the cabin wall. "By order of the territory, open up." Jacob opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The posse fanned out before him. 6 men on horseback, scarves over their faces, rifles across their saddles. Mallory sat at the front, his badge glinting dully in the weak light. "You've got something that belongs to us," the sheriff said. "Girl by the name of Eliza Hart. She left under suspicious circumstances. We aim to take her back." Jacob's shoulders squared. "She's not property," he said. "She walked up this mountain on her own. She stays if she chooses." Mallory snorted. "You expect me to believe a girl like that climbed all this way in a snowstorm? You dragged her up here, same as you dragged that big wife of yours before you chopped her up." The words landed like fists. Eliza stepped into the doorway before Jacob could answer. "I climbed," she said, her voice cutting across the cold air. "I bled my way up your mountain, Sheriff, and Jacob Winters is the only reason I'm still breathing." A murmur rippled through the men. They stared at her with open curiosity, some with pity, some with disgust. She could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them. Too big, too plain, too much. Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Miss Hart," he said smoothly, "you don't know what kind of man you're defending. You've heard the stories. You know what he did to his last woman." Eliza stepped out fully onto the porch, the cold biting through her stockings, the wind tugging at her shawl. Her hands trembled, but she did not hide them. "Yes," she said, "I've heard your stories, and I've read something else." She held up the folded witness statement. The sheriff's own signature glared up at him from the bottom like an accusation. "I know you were there," she said. "I know you saw enough to sign this piece of paper and then go back down that mountain and tell a different tale. You didn't come to rescue anyone. You came to feed the town a monster so they'd stop looking at the kind of man you are." Color rose under Mallory's stubble. "You calling me a liar, girl?" "I'm calling you a man who found it easier to blame a grieving husband than admit that sometimes the world is cruel for no reason," Eliza said steadily. "You turned a bear's claws into his axe. You turned a dead woman's body into a punchline." One of the men at the back shifted uneasily. "Sheriff, is that true? You never said nothing about a bear." Mallory's jaw flexed. "They were already dead when we got here," he snapped. "What difference does it make what killed them?" "It makes a difference to me," Eliza said. "To her." She nodded toward the graves. "To the baby. You buried the truth because it was easier to bury a fat woman's honor than admit you didn't know everything." Silence fell, thick and heavy. The wind gusted, sending a curtain of snow swirling between the riders in the cabin. Something moved in the trees. A low growl rolled across the clearing. Every head snapped toward the sound. A massive grizzly stepped out from the pines, its fur ragged, its eyes small and furious. Scar tissue furrowed its shoulder, old wounds healed badly, perhaps from a trap, perhaps from another hunter's bullet. Whatever the cause, the animal was enraged and hungry. For a second, the posse forgot Jacob, forgot Eliza, forgot the paper in her hand. Men fumbled for their rifles. Horses reared, eyes white with panic. The bear charged. Jacob moved before anyone else. He grabbed the rifle propped by the door and stepped off the porch, placing himself between the beast and the nearest horse. He fired once, twice. The shot struck, but did not stop the animal. It barreled forward, roaring, claws flailing. A third shot cracked the air. Eliza, bracing herself against the doorframe, Jacob's spare rifle pressed into her shoulder. The recoil slammed her backward, but the bullet hit true, lodging in the bear's throat. The beast crashed into the snow, sliding to a halt, so close Jacob could feel its hot breath on his boots. For a long second, no one moved. Then one of the men let out a breathless laugh. "He just saved our hides," he said. Mallory's face twisted. The story he'd been telling for 5 years was unraveling in front of half a dozen witnesses, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "This isn't over," he growled. "Truth or not, the law still says you should have come down and answered for what happened up here." Jacob looked at him, something like pity darkening his eyes. "I've been answering for it every day," he said quietly, "just not in your court." The posse rode down the mountain quieter than they had climbed it. The trader's sled creaked under the weight of the bear's carcass. No one joked. No one called Jacob a demon. Mallory rode at the front, his jaw clenched, the brim of his hat pulled low. He would still tell his tales, Eliza knew. Some men would rather chew glass than admit they'd been wrong. But he would not tell them so loud, not now that half a dozen other voices had heard another version. Back at the cabin, the world seemed to exhale. The wind dropped. The light softened. Eliza stood by the window, watching the last of the riders disappear into the trees. She felt wrung out, emptied, and filled all at once. Her hands still shook, but it was from adrenaline now, not fear. "You should sit," Jacob said. "You took the rifle like you'd done it 100 times, but you're swaying like you might fall over." She turned. He stood in the middle of the room, hat in his hands, hair flattened awkwardly where it had been pressed under the brim. Without the sheriff's shadow on the porch, he looked suddenly unsure, as if he weren't quite sure what to do with himself. "I'm not the only one who stood between a monster and the men who wanted an easy story," she said. He huffed a breath that might have become a laugh if it had had more practice. "You could have gone with them," he said softly. "You still can. They'd take you down to town. You could get a room somewhere. Find work that doesn't involve chopping wood for an old ghost." Eliza looked around the cabin. The fire's glow painted the walls in shades of amber and gold. The new bed Jacob had built for her stood under the window, its quilt smoothed by her own hands. On the table lay Mary's letter and the witness statement, side by side like two halves of a broken truth mended at last. "For most of my life, people have decided where I belong without asking me," she said slowly. "They've decided what kind of woman a body like mine deserves to be. A joke, a warning, a burden." She took a step toward him, then another. Her leg twinged, but held. "This is the first place I've ever been where the walls don't feel like they're closing in on me," she said. "Where my hunger isn't something to be mocked, but something you quietly fill without comment. Where my size is just there, like the mountain, like the sky." His throat worked. "Eliza," he said, just her name. But it was fuller than any title, shaped by respect and something gentler. "I can't promise you it will be easy," she went on. "There will always be those who prefer the monster version of you, the joke version of me. But I'd rather fight those stories together than spend the rest of my life alone trying to outrun them." Silence settled between them, soft as falling snow. Jacob stepped closer. The lamplight caught the silver starting at his temples, the scars across his knuckles, the deep loneliness in his eyes pressed into something new, hope, fragile and unfamiliar. "You're safe here," he said finally. "As long as I have breath, you're safe here. This can be your home, if you'll have it." Tears burned hot in Eliza's eyes. She let them fall. "I will," she whispered. "I do." Outside, the mountain loomed, indifferent and eternal. Inside, a small cabin shone warm against the dark. Two figures standing close in the firelight, trying to believe that love could be stronger than rumor, stronger than grief, stronger than the stories that had nearly destroyed them. Whether it would be enough to hold against everything waiting beyond the trees, only time could say. Stories, travel farther than footsteps. A lie can roll down a mountain and flatten a man's life. And a truth can lie buried in a tin box for years, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. If you've stayed with Eliza and Jacob this far, some part of you knows what it is to be misjudged by your shape, your past, your pain. Every time you share a story like this, you're choosing which version of the world gets to be louder, the cruel one or the kinder one. And if you still believe in second chances, this story was always meant for you.